to Mindcrime Liberty Show with me, Stephen Dobson, and him, Tim Patton. Today we're joined by Rik Storey to discuss what causes the decline of civilisations. I was watching one of Rik's videos on his own YouTube channel, which was on what causes the decline of civilisations. And I kind of thought, well, let's get him on to talk about it. So, Rik, what causes the decline of civilisations? Well, and the rise, for that matter, but predominantly the decline.
I knew you were going to start with the big questions with them. What causes the rise of civilizations? Well, we could start with when a nomad group encounters a peasant group. Typically now, academic literature tends to think that this interplay between these two different kinds of groups is when you get the formation of, well, yes, okay, an empire, but more specifically, you might say a civilization. It's when you have a nomadic group forming an aristocracy over a peasantry, that you have a warrior class forming over the, I don't want to say the working class, but I think everyone knows what I mean when I say that, the peasants, really. Now, the relationship is not necessarily so authoritarian. Actually, when we see empires forming, it tends to be that these two groups find each other mutually beneficial, and they find the combining of forces and intermarriage to be, as I say, beneficial over time. The warrior class, obviously, being nomadic, they have superior weapons which they can carry around with them. They have cattle and horses, so they're much more mobile. Because of their diet and maybe sort of evolutionary reasons, they tend to be bigger. They're just more dominant figures. They've lived a very different life, whereas the peasantry tends to have less of a meat-based diet, and they're stuck to the land. They're anchored to the land, and so in terms of what they can accomplish militarily, it's always going to be lesser than what the nomads can accomplish. So these two groups finding mutual benefit, the nomads finding the variety and continual source of supplies that come from the peasantry. That's obviously of great benefit to them over time. Certainly it's much more useful than just raiding a village and killing everyone there. Then you can't continue to have a relationship with these people. You can't year after year continue to benefit from being friendly with them. And also the peasants find this this band of nomads to be useful, not just for deterring marauders, maybe more malevolent groups that might be roaming, but also they're quite useful as a third party for settling disputes. And so this is where at a much later stage you might have, say, a king and his court, with its route around the country and holding court in different places in order to settle disputes. So, that's a really truncated version, but that's basically how what we might call, an empire or the beginnings of a specific identifiable civilization might actually form. In terms of what causes their decline, I think we need to really look at the whole curve. So we need to look at how empires then, rise to and to what kind of apex, in order to then determine what's the opposite of that. So it seems to be very much like the meme that everyone is quite familiar with now of, hard times create strong men create good times, and good times create weak men, and then weak men create the hard times. And so the cycle goes on. We might think of the hard times creating the strong men as being that sort of beginning stage of a civilization where these very strong nomads forming a warrior class. The reason they're so tough is because they have a lot of competition with other nomad groups, and also within the group itself. These tend to be very patriarchal societies, and physical dexterity and strength tends to be of great importance to them. You have to be an archer as well as be good with a sword or some kind of handheld weapon. You have to master horse riding, particularly in battle. You need to be able to shoot arrows on horseback, which is remarkably difficult, requires a lot of strength. That sort of thing. So these are the strong men, if you like, that form, and then they in order to then have some continuity within the larger territory that they then protect, if you like. That's where we get our word territory from. It's a Roman word, the territorium. Literally, this is a locality in which they terrify competition away for that job. And so this class, this group of strong men, if you like, they then have this territory within which there is relative peace. And then within that territory, the smaller like peasant groups and they're able to not just trade amongst themselves in peace, but then they can trade with neighboring villages, neighboring towns. You can then get the formation of cities, an acropolis, if you like. And this is when we start to get merchants and more of a city class of people that we might be more familiar with. We start to then get an actual bourgeois people who are then capable of, what can we say, higher order jobs and things. And so then we really start to get in the flowering of this civilization. These are what we might say then the good times created by the strong men. You have a territory, and within that territory there is peace. Now maybe this might form an empire. So the territory that this group have authority within. They might exercise. So they exercise an imperium, if you like. It expands, perhaps as far as it can go, and then you have an empire. Now, this will be then, if you like, the apex. They've reached the furthermost point. The empire expands, to its greatest extent, and within that. The competition turns from looking outwards to outward, competition, other empires and other groups who are antagonistic towards you. And then the competition starts to turn inward. Well, in what way can it turn inward? Do people start attacking each other militarily? Well, I mean, that can happen. You might have a coup or something like that. But typically, instead of great civil wars and things like that, the competition tends to be an economic one. Trade becomes the order of the day, and economic concerns within this peaceful territorium become the what can I say, the only vector remaining through which there's competition. And so then we start to get to the point where good times create weak men. Now, there are a couple of books that I found interesting, and these are the ones I mentioned in my video. They're both called The Fate of Empires, both written by British men One is Sir John Glubb, and the other one is Arthur John Hubbard, who was a doctor. They were both living in the twilight of the British Empire, and they both independently wrote, these two essay/booklets, and they both independently arrived at the same title for their book, and they also arrived at very, very similar conclusions. Both of them were looking at empires past, given the historical data that they had at the time, and both of them focused especially on what causes empires to decline, and what does that look like, and what can prevent the collapse of an empire. That was what they were most concerned with. Obviously, they didn't want to see the collapse of the British Empire, and so they were concerned with identifying the patterns of what collapse looks like and how they can prevent it. Now, the conclusion they came to was, as economic competition within the group, within the empire, within a civilization, as that becomes much more important, you will see an abandonment of the public religion. You will see greater concern with status signaling in economic terms. They might look around, let's say, at the collapsing West and see, people having massive Louis Vuitton symbols on their handbags, and Gucci written in huge letters on someone's actually rather cheap looking jumper, and they might think, oh, this makes perfect sense. These are big status signals. Look, I can afford a Gucci jumper.
Are status symbols much different from military, distinguishing by your military strength?
Yeah,
why is that relevantly different?
But that's a really good point, Stephen, because one of the other things they look at is who are the heroes? Who are the heroes, and what are the values of a collapsing civilization? So there's two sides to this. On the one hand, you'll have moralizing about how heroes of the former age, who are obviously very martial figures, they will be kings and conquerors, how morally detestable they are now, and how we are so much more morally evolved now that we can actually have some distance from these people, and we can reflect on what's so bad about them and how we would do things differently. And obviously the tearing down of statues of former heroes, this is nothing new. The tearing down of statues across the West, they would see nothing strange about this at all. It would make perfect sense according to their observations. And so on the other side, what are the things that are positively enforced? And it would be having more money, the sort of you do you attitude, and so the people who then become the idols of that collapsing civilization would be famous artists and poets, singers, dancers, so more on the sort of the arts side of thing, and their voices, of course, would become louder. Women too would have a more political role and a greater say in what public policy should be. Albeit maybe not to the extent that we've seen in the West more recently, but that's debatable, I suppose. And so basically, those who are economically successful and more entertaining, those would then become the idols. And so what would the value be? Well, the values become much more selfish is, perhaps too vague of a term, but certainly what these two authors seem to observe, and others, more recently who have studied the collapses of civilization, is people tend to become more individualistic, So it seems that there is.
What do you mean by individualistic? You were saying selfish was
Yes.
vague. I think individualistic is even more vague.
Equally vague. Well,
what does that mean? Because you can. It depends what you mean. Because I mean, you could. Because it's. Would you say if it was the case that you have somebody who held the view that what you need to do is to maximize individual human flourishing as an individual, but that flourishing would only take place in the context of a coherent and stable social order, would that be an individualist by your use of the term individualist or individualistic?
Well, I don't think it's so much that one might be concerned with individual well-being. Of course, Aristotle, he was all about the eudaimonia, so the individual person seeking and growing to understand more and more what the better life would be for themselves. But as you say, he was also then the first to say that this is actually achieved, and this is actually nourished and encouraged to grow within groups, starting with the family, and then going up to the polis, the Greek city-state as he would have seen it. And in the medieval period, we see that continued, where of course, the individual Christian soul is it's totally recognized. Following Saint Augustine, we have very much the subject, the Western individual, and this is of great concern in legal matters, but nevertheless to the medieval mind, or in the medieval world, the individual and his rights were totally tied up with his personhood, and that was something that was identified and achieved within the small groups, so within the family, within the guild, within various smaller order groups that a person would have been part of. So it's not necessarily people start caring about individual people, or they start believing that individual people have private property, should have private property, or that they have certain rights. It's not that. It's more that what Swithin, perhaps you, or Tim, perhaps you can remember the author of a book. Their name escapes me at the moment, but it was called Bowling Alone, and I just cannot remember the name of the sociologist who wrote that.
Putnam, I believe.
Thank you. Yes. So what he observed was in America, particularly as cities and other places in America become more pluralistic in their values and religions and that sort of thing, people tend to be more distrusting of others, and they tend to engage much less with public institutions. And obviously, thus the title Bowling Alone. He looks at how we've gone from, let's say, a situation like 1950s America, where people seem to be much more involved in public affairs, and even if this is something that they are themselves organizing, it's not like a government thing. But people have distanced themselves from that to the point that they don't have friends outside of work, outside of their family. Maybe they go to a cafe and they might know the person at the desk, but they don't. They're not a part of some institution outside of that.
So is your claim then? So back to individualism then. Is it not a case that it's more individualistic, but rather the decline is because of a lack of become a lower trust society and therefore becomes less coherent? Is that the main claim? And then the individualism however so defined, is a means by which the high trust society becomes a lower trust society, or am I misunderstanding you?
Well, I think it's all of those things. I think
Well, which comes first, or do they happen at the same time?
In terms of
the individualism and the trust.
Yes.
Because it would seem clear that the society will slowly decline insofar as the trust level goes down. I think that's pretty much. I mean, I don't think that'd be hugely controversial. The question is how it would take place. So what I'm asking is, according to the theories of Gleb and the other guy, I can't remember his name, is it that somehow individualism so defined appears, which then erodes social trust, or is it that the trust dissipates for another reason, and because the trust dissipates, people turn in on themselves, or do they happen both at the same time? And if so, what's the relationship?
I think it's all part of the same process, really. I think the thing that we're calling individualism is the erosion of those institutions and the changing in the mindset of the people. Which I would look at, and I would see is, it seems to be just a natural process. This just seems to be how humans behave when their civilization is, the values of the civilization are slowly turning.
So, and which public institutions in all these cases are the ones that are necessary to have high sort of social status, for which people will care and will attempt to maintain, which you need, which then to maintain the civilization at its height, which are then disregarded and then decrease in their social status and importance and care by the community, such that the community then goes into decline?
Well, I would agree with one of these two authors. Both of them say this actually, but one of them puts a special focus on this, especially in one of the chapters of the booklet. I think that it is the erosion of the religious values within the society. Now, the reason I think that is because in order for the civilization to grow in the first place, there has to be a concern, a motive which transcends, the individual's concern. If we're going to make sacrifices for future generations, and it may be something that we are not going to ourselves experience the fruits of, we're not going to see this, so what would an example be? Maybe the construction of a cathedral that may take place over generations. Money and time, various efforts and sacrifices may go into that, knowing that you will not yourself see the finished product in your lifetime, but knowing that perhaps your great grandchildren or your grandchild or whatever may then see. So what brings you out of your more immediate concerns within your own lifetime, and the competition for resources and that sort of thing that you will have to experience in order to get on in your life. Well, for Arthur John Hubbard, he called it the religious motive. And so he was looking at, for instance, through Latin Christendom in the Middle Ages, or, for instance, China, across the passing of various dynasties. Well, what was the continuity which prevented the whole civilization from entirely collapsing and dissolving? And he said, well, it's this religious motive. And so it seems to be that as a civilization is growing, especially for the strong men who are creating this civilization, creating the good times, that they need to have a shared ideology. They need to have shared objective values which are going to, encourage them in their, their martial endeavours, and they'll be making tremendous sacrifices, but probably sacrificing their lives. So, well, what is bringing them together? What's the cohesion that's making these men, fight for the same project, and to do so across time, to pass the mantle. And so Hubbard said, it seems to be the religious motive, and I would agree that's what it seems to be. And so, as moneyed concerns start to overtake or seemingly to become, more important in a civilization where everything is easy. Relatively, you have a very high quality of life. You don't have to really sacrifice a huge amount for that. And actually, even, and we're starting to see this more in Western countries. In my experience, I've seen this more with very wealthy families from across Asia. It starts to become even a status signal. If you can afford to spoil your child, if you can afford to have your child, not really work very hard, not want for nothing, not to do any chores, they have whatever they want, the most expensive things, and it's meaningless to them because they can have it at the drop of a hat. To be able to raise a child in that way itself becomes a status signal, and there's nothing new about that. As especially the wealthier classes become more that way, and as people who just have lots of cash to flash, and they're living very luxurious lives with tremendous ease, as that starts to become more valuable or of higher status, and of as that becomes more morally permissible in a civilization, the entropic nature of humans is such that more and more people will start to care less about the religion and all of those sacrificial values which once made the empire or the civilization or whatever
Rik,
it is great.
Let me interrupt here. Speaking of like ends and sacrifices, so what would you say is the end of the sacrifice? So like take our current society, what you're describing about which is I somewhat witnessed this firsthand too. We're describing somewhat in Asia and as well as Western Europe, United States, as people being very affluent and sort of not having to work very hard. Isn't that in a sense like I once emailed there's a church event I occasionally involve myself with. And I once emailed the guy. I wrote an email, and it wasn't that he was being a Marxist Christian, but I was saying like, what's the purpose of going to school? Like, what's the purpose of working? Is to acquire resources. And again, school again in the modern American context. Like, if you want to criticize, like, I imagine it's European context. And Nietzsche also pointing this out is that like the real purpose of education is to increase your own power. That's like the formal. That's like that ends up being people go to school so they can make more money, or they can join the bureaucracy, or they can join. Now again, I don't really per se see anything reason wrong with that. I mean that's an argument that education is not part of the public good. But what would you say the end of all these sacrifices? Because you get this idea. Well, we'll work harder so our kids are better off. And I happened to have the TV on at one. I saw CNBC had a show, I think it's Undercover Boss, and they were just profiling this guy who was working 75 hours a week, and he was doing it for his kids. He wanted his kids to have a nice life. Okay, that's a nice reason, but what about the kids? Like, should the kids, should he actually work less? And now you can always, of course, make pure market and pure Marxist and pure market critiques. Well, he wouldn't have to work as hard if such and such exploitation happened, and that's probably true. But even so, there is the idea that you work less to make, like, you work less hard now, so you work hard now, so your kids. But what do you do about the next generation then? Isn't that just an entropic process where no one really answers what there is to done? It's just, we're going to sacrifice things. Sacrifice them for what? Like in the Christian context, and this, I think Christianity has a sort of, it reminds me, not to start you to, it reminds me of the Death Star. It has a sort of a problem in there, deep inside of it, where its relationship to earthly wealth and power is always one that's rather tenuous. Here's to speak. That'd be my problem. Like, what do you sacrifice it toward it? Like a Christian good is not really a material good, and an empire is a material good. So I'm in the context of Christianity, I think empire is always, which I would think is your answer to the, what do you sacrifice for? That would, I think, be your answer if I'm guessing is correct. But how do you square that problem? It seems like internal to it there is this problem at its core. Like people obviously aren't as Christian as they used to be, for better or for worse. But in earlier times, people were more Christian. They actually fought over what Christianity meant. So, like in the 1930s, for example, you get super Protestants who very much believe, but like Woodrow Wilson, for example, I don't have any reason. Maybe he was a secret atheist, but he was a Presbyterian trained seminary, I think. So there's always a thing, like, deep inside of Christianity. If you answer the sacrifice, what do you sacrifice for? I don't know. I don't have an easy answer for that question. And Asia is becoming more Christianized too, so I suspect that those parents would end up having the same problems or same empires if it ever did arise. What do you make of that comment, Rick? Like, what would you say the sacrifice for? It just seems like it's a entropic process.
Yeah,
Sorry for the rambling question.
Not at all. I think I think you just hit on the crux of the whole thing, Tim, because I actually think that is the pressing question of our time, especially for I would say young European men, or what can you say, like white men as well, young American, young Western men who have tremendously high suicide rates, we should note. And it seems, the society around them increasingly despises them, associates them with, past warmongering and all this sort of thing. And they're supposed to still work and pay taxes, to this society? Well, why? And I saw an article recently, I can't remember where it was, perhaps it was something like The Guardian, I can't remember now, but it was sort of praising young people for asking this exact question, for saying, well, what is the point in working? Young people are increasingly not working so hard in their jobs and, looking for more time off and all of this sort of thing. And they were seeing this as a good thing. I see this as a terribly bad thing, not in the sense that they are, trying to attain more fairness for themselves as workers and not to be exploited or something like that, but because what this is saying is, young people don't see the point. They don't see any larger project which they are really a part of. What is it all about? Is it all about money? Well, the example you gave, Tim, of the person who's working really, really hard for their family, but hardly spending any time with their family. Well, just working purely for money. Is that the reason you're making that? Well, it's money. Well, money, I'm sorry, doesn't solve all problems. You're okay. So you work hard, work really, really, really hard. Throw loads of cash at your children, and then somebody gets cancer. Now what do you do? The reason I think focusing on, really we come back to the question of what is the good life? And for me, this is a spiritual question, and that's not something ethereal. We're just talking about objective values, things like truth, things like goodness, things like beauty, which we all behave as though those things exist. So what is a beautiful life? What does a beautiful family life look like? These questions are not too abstract. I think they're fundamentally important. And so, in studies they've done, people at the end of their lives, they're asked, what are your regrets? I think number one was working more than I needed to and not spending enough time with my family. So growing the souls of your children, growing your children so that they have this inner life which is very strong. So when the storm does hit, when somebody does get cancer, they have this inner strength to continue and to carry on and to do the same, and to create a more beautiful and a happier family life themselves, to be really enriching and for all the people in your life, your friends, your family, your neighbors, to help them to grow and to have this greater inner strength. And really, what could it be? So what is the good life? Why are we making sacrifices? What's it all for? I suppose it's for us, not perhaps first and foremost as individuals, to be strong enough to weather the storms, and after that, it would be to that then have so much strength that you're then able to be a source of encouragement for your loved ones, for those around you, and maybe even then to develop even more relationships in your life, and to really become a pillar of your community, as we used to say. And in that sense, I mean, that's what a civilization is. I mean, it's all these strong men, if you like, creating good times.
What I'm not following is, why is that something that's more likely to take place after you get to a certain level of economic ability? Because you could imagine someone worked too much of being in the warrior class, and let's suppose in the classic warrior class situation, maybe have polygamy from some of the higher status warriors who wouldn't spend any time with their children at all. And they didn't spend very much time with their family because they were fighting. Is it that, are there other things that we haven't mentioned which are important when it comes to the overall value system of the society once it reaches a certain economic level within its arc, not absolute economic level, because that would make comparisons between times more difficult. What is it? Is it that for some reason it's more likely that you will neglect familial obligations when the economy gets so high up, or is it other values that you don't hold which are relevant, which we haven't mentioned? So related to that is, what sacrifices would the hard men make which the relatively softer men of the mercantile class wouldn't make, which would be required to maintain the civilization? I realize that's a number of questions in one, but those are the thoughts that were going through my head.
Well, I mean, I think in terms of the nomads marauding around and killing people, and maybe not really having much of what we would recognize to be a stable family structure, I see that as being sort of pre-economic in a certain sense. If we talk about civilization, the nomads by themselves are not really forming the civilization. It's when they have this relationship with this very different sort of community, the peasants, the farmers, the sort of stationary, if you like, workers.
That's true. Let's suppose it was the peasantry at that time. Why would they be more likely to build a civilization with their children, or would they be working loads of hours and not spending with the time, or was it just or is it a fact of urbanization but you don't deal with your family as much as you would do in a more agricultural, less urban society. Is that a fact here that's behind a lot of stuff we haven't mentioned?
Well, I think that, if you're living, some sort of, pre-agricultural revolution, really hard graft, barely surviving existence, yeah, I mean, maybe what we might identify as the family structure in that group might be abysmal, in our, according to our standards. But yeah, I mean, I think that as you have these two different groups come together, this starts to form, it starts to create more dynamic relationships. And, this kind of gives life or gives birth to, something altogether different, so that you can have, all kinds of different groups performing different roles, like different organs within an organism. And they all have some sort of mutual benefit. And then what the overall benefit of this would be, and again, this goes back to Aristotle, I suppose, and Plato. The overall benefit there is then you start to have a proper economy. And what does economy mean? Economy, obviously, that's the ancient Greek word for household. And I see that as being very significant, because what that means then is now you have a sort of seed bed. Now you have, the proper institutions and everything in place for healthy, flourishing families to prosper. And you have a situation where children can be given this proper instruction, so that their higher order needs, there's more abstract needs, things that transcend yourself and make you really feel a part of something greater, and so you're really accomplishing something that transcends you and will stand the test of time. As well as those things which, and again, the very largest studies on human happiness have shown that, good relationships with, a variety of people, friends, neighbors, family, those things are what people ultimately find the most fulfilling by far. And so these things now are able to come into place. And it is for that reason that Aristotle went so far as to say that the polis has priority before the family. Now, what he means by that is not, and this is a misconception, common one, that Aristotle was saying the polis kind of pre-exists the family. He wasn't saying that at all. That would be really un-Aristotelian of him. What he's saying is that because it's only once you start to get to that level where all those things are in place, and real families start to come into place, and the instruction of children and their inner spiritual growth starts to become a very real possibility. That's what makes the polis of a priority in terms of actually being able to achieve the betterment of people's lives, and actually being able to achieve the good life and the common good.
So, go on, Tim.
Wouldn't you say though that the and this sort of, I have this sort of problem here. Wouldn't you say the betterment is itself ends up being in practice just a material betterment, where it ends up being those, as you identify, those families who view it as a status that their kids don't have to work? Isn't that the sort of quote unquote goal? And actually, again, Marxists. What's interesting about old school Marxists is this was more or less the Marxist dream of a kind. And David Bentley Hart who's no friend of capitalism, and in his First Things essays on this, would point that out as well, that the Marxist goal is a society where, in a sense, we're all hyper privileged consumers, where you have the, again, and like if we can define robots and economic systems to alleviate onerous labor, I don't really see any reason against that explicitly. But I do think people enjoy working somewhat anyway, so maybe that explains some why people like to work. So there is sort of problems of workaholicism and so forth. So like like the lying down movement, that could just be a rational choice. It's like, well, again, it seems like even the ends of an empire just seem to be like, well, having a gold-plated bathroom and a bunch of servants. Now, again, you could have electronic, or you have motorized servant. I know John Stuart Mill is probably correct that no labor-saving device saved any labor, but I that seems to be at least the dream that people are sacrificing toward is some sort of what would you be argument against that, Rick? Like, isn't it just another material isn't that just another material paradise, Rick? Anything to say?
Well, so I mean, Arthur John Hubbard's argument is not that, hey, if we were just all a bit more religious, then that there wouldn't be these sort of turns in civilization where people start to become more interested in money, and they become bored of all that sacrifice stuff. Sounds like so much hard work. For him, it's more that where you have a solid bedrock of the religious motive within your civilization, these turns don't lead then to a complete dissolution of the civilization, but they become more just a sort of winter that the civilization goes through, and then things pick up again. So, I mean, do I see the gold-plated bathtub as just like an inevitable end for civilizations, as people start to think, well, hey, why am I working? I'm working just for more money, so I can have more material pleasures. I think given human nature, I think that as maybe things improve economically, that kind of thing, that's almost, I don't want to discount human agency here, because I'm not a hard determinist, but it does seem like, okay, I guess people are probably going to start thinking that way, and just seeking more comfort, if you like. But then I think there are things that can be done in a society. I think that there are institutions that can come about where men will encourage more certain behaviors in each other. So, for instance, nothing will cause a man to learn how to change the tire on his own car than being shamed by other men, and being made to feel inadequate, that sort of thing. He'll again, he may probably then start to change his behaviors and learn how to do something like that. Now imagine that the places he frequents, and the friendship groups that he's in, and the institutions he's a part of, that sort of thing. Everywhere he goes, he'll be encountering men where all the other guys are just expecting of the other men that they will, have a certain level of what they would deem to be masculinity, which may include you mow your own lawn, you change the tire on your own car, you're capable of doing certain things for yourself, and you're not, then it would be seen as a sign of weakness to just palm it off to some other factor in the market. Because at that point it would just be seen as being weak. And what the overall process would be then, if everyone's doing that for every little thing, is we become over specialized, and we become unable to do certain things for ourselves, and so we become hopelessly dependent on others for things. by which point, we probably got a tremendous amount of gun control, and we can't even defend ourselves, and we would expect, the police to come, or, we wouldn't have some kind of neighborhood watch where we're, really a part of these things, and we're, an integral part of the organization of defending our neighborhood even, heaven forbid, we just have insurance and that sort of thing. So, I think that, religion, institutions within the society, being a part of, a proper order of subsidiarity in the society where, we're organized, and we're holding each other accountable, in a personal way. This doesn't have to be authoritarian. But I think that those things are absolutely essential for staving off civilizational collapse. And I think it's obvious, frankly.
So what values would you say are the most important? Maybe 1, 2, 3, a small number, whichever ones you think were the most important that the strong men would hold as a value, that the weak men in the mercantile times wouldn't hold. And if they were to reverse this would then maybe not reverse the collapse, but at least prevent it from going very quickly.
My answer's I'm going to try and make my answer not too biased, because, as you know, I'm a Catholic, and so I have my beliefs. But I would say, public attendance of public, religious rituals and rites is, a kind of almost a requirement. It's to say the very least frowned upon to not be attending those things. So public religion is maybe number one. Number two, I would say, is traditional family values. I think everyone knows exactly what I mean by that. If they say they don't, I think they're lying. It is just a universal thing where, women are the wife and they look after the children. I'm not saying this to offend anyone. I'm saying it because it's just, a sociological fact. It's so exceptionally rare, where there are exceptions to this, that it's hardly even worth mentioning. And the men are the ones that make the sacrifices for the family outside of the household, and they are the ultimate judge and decision maker for any major decisions for the family. Yes, so I think that's it. Obviously, we did a whole other show on this, didn't we? I would see marriage, traditional marriage, as being bound up with that kind of family value, which I don't think is too vague at all, really. And I think just getting those two right for a start would be fantastic. But if I was to say a third one, I think that men need to have men only, not just spaces, but institutions, and preferably they would be ones which were more martial in character. So, for instance, I love the fact that Switzerland has these sort of militia groups, but they are, they are official. They are legitimately the militia groups for the country. I don't see that as being a bad thing. I see having a culture that views the men in society that way is a very healthy thing, and has a very healthy understanding of what a sustainable civilization looks like. So perhaps, if I can put that in just a few words, a sort of male-only preferably militia-oriented groups within the society.
No, that's interesting. So, how does the mercantile times diminish those? Is it that they don't see as much value in them because they're more independent, economically independent, and so don't require, say, everybody else in the same way for public religious observers? Obviously, when it comes to militia, you can outsource it. Well, typically it's the case that the centralized state authorities have their own army because they're more loyal to the leaders rather than to the local communities. So I would agree with you on. That can happen in multiple ways. But how does the decline of those three things tie in with increased affluence?
Yes, it is pretty much just that. Is money provides this illusion that you can do anything. Whereas exactly as you said, Swithin, then if you start saying, oh well, I can start outsourcing some of this stuff. You then start outsourcing things that you should probably be accepting personal responsibility for. Because the outsourcing of it sets various bad trends, which then lead to less of a public life, fewer institutions within the society, and people then start taking less and less of an active role in the public religion, to say the least, until all the relationships in your life become business transactions rather than personal ones, favors, things that are very human and very organic, you might say. So I'd say money makes this illusion where you think you can relinquish responsibilities for things without any consequence, but there are larger, more civilization-wide, if you like, consequences with men especially doing that.
So my last question, then we're coming up to an hour, related to this, is what type of sacrifice would the hard man make which keeps civilization going that the man of the mercantile times is less likely to make? You've mentioned sacrifice multiple times. What type of sacrifices, or put it another way, if you were to pick the most important sacrifices that they wouldn't make, what wouldn't they make? And that's it.
The most important sacrifice that a strong man might make. Well, I suppose perhaps it might relate to not being a philanderer or something like that. So being a family man, devoted. Look at the Italian mafia, for instance. It seems like a cliche, but I think it is so for a reason. They might still be Italian men, and so they might still have serious problems with their libido, and they may even have an affair or five, and but nevertheless, what is expected of them, and what indeed they would probably be expecting of all the men in society, especially within their own little honor group, is that they would, ultimately be devoted to, protecting their wife and their children, and giving them instruction so that their children, whether it's sons or daughters, might also grow up to be strong like them. What makes them so strong? Well, they're still expected to, give nods to the public religion, and to, in their own special way, be upholding the values of that religion, and they're expected. They expect of men to have an attitude of being, defensive towards the women and the children. That is the greatest sin you could possibly make is to harm women and children, or to even let them see the violence that maybe they engage in with other men in their their side dealings. And so I think it's that, the greatest sacrifice a man makes is to become a at the very least outwardly, publicly religious figure. Maybe not religious figure, I misspoke there, but they're expected to uphold the public religion, let's say, and they're expected to be devoted to their family alone, certainly, economically speaking, but also in terms of the spiritual instruction. They're expected to be the sort of hopefully, as physically strong as they could be, and they are a spiritual instructor in their home. I think that's why, for instance, a show like The Sopranos becomes so interesting, because Tony Soprano is living in a time when really he's not expected to do any of these things anywhere other than maybe slightly so within his little group. And so it's like, well, what purpose really does this group of mafiosos actually have anymore? And he's a hopeless failure in terms of the instruction of his own family, with whom he's so distant spiritually from. I think that's probably the most interesting thing about that show. It's a good sort of character study in exactly the kind of things that we're talking about.
Thank you for joining us, Rick. That's been an interesting discussion. I'd now like to thank everyone for listening. If you enjoyed this podcast, please share it with your friends and family, and subscribe to us on Podbean and on YouTube. The more subscribers we get, the higher we get in the search rankings, and the more people can access this material. And if you'd like to contact the show for any reason at all, please contact us at mindcrimelibernetyshow@gmail.com. That's mindcrimelibernetyshow@gmail.com.